The phone rang. It was 12:03 a.m. The silence of the night was only interrupted by the sharp, shrill sound echoing through Keanu Reeves's quiet home. He jolted awake, his heart skipping a beat as he turned to look at the clock. Who could be calling? At this hour? For a man who prided himself on the peace and solitude he had worked so hard to cultivate, this sudden disruption felt wrong. Keanu rubbed his eyes, still groggy, and glanced at the phone screen. The number was unfamiliar, yet there was something oddly familiar about it. His thumb hovered over the screen, a split-second decision on whether to answer or ignore. But something in his gut told him he had to pick up. He didn't know why, he just felt it. "Hello?" he muttered into the receiver, his voice hoarse from sleep. There was a moment of silence on the other end, followed by a breathless voice, barely audible, but sharp with urgency. "Keanu, you need to listen carefully. They know everything. They're coming for you." His heart sank. Before he could respond, the line went dead. Keanu sat there in the darkness, his fingers still gripping the phone, staring at the screen as if willing the call to return. But it didn't. His mind raced, heart thumping in his chest. Who was that? What did they mean, "they're coming for you"? He thought about calling Lawrence, his closest friend, but he couldn't shake the feeling that whoever had called was already one step ahead. The cryptic words left him unsettled, like a warning that couldn't be ignored. And why him? Why now? Keanu leaned back against the bed, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and fear. This was no ordinary prank call. Something was coming. Something he wasn't prepared for. Before he could process it further, the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had no choice now but to follow this path wherever it might lead. What had just started at midnight would send his world spiraling out of control. But before we dive deeper into this shocking chain of events, make sure to hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. You won't want to miss the twists and turns that lie ahead. Keanu Reeves was no stranger to the limelight. For decades, he had been a fixture in Hollywood, his name synonymous with action-packed thrillers, deep introspective roles, and the kind of humility that made him stand out in an industry filled with egos. But few people knew the real Keanu, the quiet man who, despite his fame, sought refuge in the shadows. Keanu had always been a private individual, often keeping his personal life far away from the public eye. His childhood had been one of instability, marked by constant moves across different cities and countries. Raised by a single mother after his father's abandonment, Keanu had learned to fend for himself early on. His family was small, but the loss of his sister Kim to a tragic accident had left an indelible mark on his soul. The grief of losing her haunted him, casting a shadow over every success and joy that came his way. Yet despite the pain and the loneliness, Keanu had found a strange peace in his solitude. Over the years, he had cultivated a life of simplicity, living in a modest house tucked away from the chaos of Los Angeles. He had a close-knit group of friends, including Lawrence Fishburne, who had been a guiding force in his life for decades. Still, even among his closest friends, Keanu preferred to remain a bit of an enigma. There were parts of his past, parts of his heart that he kept locked away. His career was something that kept him busy, but it was his private life that shaped him. Keanu had learned early that fame was fleeting, but the relationships you build, whether with family or friends, are the ones that truly matter. Yet no matter how much time passed, the loss of Kim remained the ghost that haunted every corner of his heart. As the years went by, Keanu's career flourished, but so did his desire for peace. The late nights and public appearances became less frequent. He sought comfort in the quiet of his own space, indulging in the simplicity of reading, yoga, and long walks along the coast. But something in him had always felt like he was waiting for something, though he could never quite put his finger on what. The call he had received that night, though, was something he could never have predicted. It wasn't just an intrusion into his quiet life. It was a crack in the facade, a disruption to everything he had come to believe about himself and his world. But who was behind the call, and why now? Keanu wasn't sure, but one thing was certain. This wasn't just some random phone call. It was the beginning of something much bigger, and it was about to pull him into a web of mysteries he was not prepared for. As he tried to process the events of the past few minutes, A chill ran down his spine. His peaceful life, the one he had spent years building, was about to unravel, and the people who had called him knew something about him that he had tried so hard to keep buried. And so, the journey began, pulling Keanu away from everything he had ever known and throwing him into a world of uncertainty and danger. The days that followed were unsettling, filled with strange occurrences and mounting tension. Keanu found himself unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched. At first, it was just a subtle sensation, like someone standing just behind him, out of sight. But then it escalated. It started with the unfamiliar cars parked near his house. He had seen them parked a few times over the past couple of days. Different cars, different makes, always parked just far enough away to avoid suspicion. But the pattern was undeniable. They were watching him. He'd caught sight of figures in the shadows, quickly disappearing as soon as he approached. Keanu wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. He had always kept his guard up, but now he couldn't ignore the unsettling reality that something was amiss. He'd tried calling Lawrence, but the phone rang endlessly, and when it finally went to voicemail, Keanu felt a sudden pang of isolation. His closest friend was unreachable, and that made everything feel worse. He spent the next few hours pacing around his home, peering through windows and double-checking locks. It was as though the walls were closing in on him. But no matter how hard he tried to shake the feeling, he couldn't escape the sense of impending danger. Late that night, as he sat in the living room, the phone buzzed once again. Keanu's heart leapt into his throat as he glanced at the screen. Another unknown number. It was the same kind of eerie feeling he'd gotten during the first call, the kind that made him feel like something was about to break wide open. This time, he didn't hesitate. He answered. "Keanu," came the voice on the other end, its tone cold and clipped. "You're being followed. We don't have much time." His blood ran cold as the words echoed in his mind. "Who is this?" he demanded, but the voice didn't answer directly. Instead, there was a sharp intake of breath, as if someone was weighing the decision of what to say next. "We know everything about you, your family, your past, the people who betrayed you," the voice continued. "They're coming for you, Keanu. You have to leave now." Keanu's mind raced. Who was they? Who was this person warning him? He didn't know, but he could feel the weight of their words pressing down on him. Before he could say anything, else the line went dead once more. Keanu sat frozen, his breath shallow, his mind spiraling. What was going on? Who was behind all of this? Why had they targeted him? The quiet life he had built over the years was rapidly shattering. The darkness he'd once sought to avoid was now consuming him, pulling him into a web of mystery and danger. The questions piled up faster than the answers. The following morning, Keanu tried to call Lawrence again, but this time his friend picked up. "Keanu, where have you been? I've been trying to reach you. You okay?" Lawrence asked, his voice sounding urgent. "I don't know," Keanu replied, the weight of the situation sinking in. "I think I'm in some kind of trouble. There's someone after me. They know things about my past, things I didn't even know they knew. And I don't know who to trust anymore." Lawrence paused, his voice growing serious. "Listen to me, Keanu. Whatever this is, you need to be careful. If they know things about your past, they might be connected to something much bigger. You need to figure out who these people are and why they're after you. This isn't just some coincidence." Keanu could feel the urgency in his friend's words, but it didn't ease the tension building inside him. There was something far more sinister at play here. Whoever had made that call wasn't playing games, and they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Keanu stood up, pacing again. He didn't know where to go or who to turn to. Every lead felt like a dead end. He was in too deep now. There was no turning back. The storm was coming, and Keanu was at the eye of it. Every choice he made from this point forward would determine how far he'd fall, or whether he'd be able to rise above it all. But the question loomed. What did they want with him? What did they know about him, and how far would they go to? Get it? The following days felt like a blur to Keanu. He couldn't remember the last time he had slept properly. Every knock at the door, every car passing by his driveway made his pulse race. It was as if his entire life had been turned into a game of cat and mouse, and he was the prey. He couldn't stay in his house anymore. not with the constant feeling that someone was always lurking just beyond his reach. Lawrence's warnings echoed in his mind. If they know things about your past, they might be connected to something much bigger. Keanu had no idea what that something bigger was, but he couldn't ignore it any longer. He had to get out. He had to find answers. That night, Keanu packed a small bag with essentials, his wallet, a few changes of clothes, and his passport. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he had to leave. As he loaded his car, he cast one last glance at his home, the place he had come to love for its peace and solitude. It suddenly felt foreign, as though it no longer belonged to him. Keanu took the long, winding road out of Los Angeles, heading north along the coast. The vast open landscape was both calming and isolating. It gave him space to think, but the constant unease never left him. Every time a car appeared in his rearview mirror, his stomach tightened. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He thought about the voice on the phone. "We know everything about you." The person who had called seemed to know not just about his career, but about his personal life, his childhood, his family, even the tragic accident that had taken his sister. It was as if they had been watching him for years, waiting for the right moment to strike. Keanu kept driving through the night, his thoughts spiraling. What did they want from him? And who were they? Were they the same people who had been sending him cryptic warnings? Or was there something much darker at play? Around dawn, Keanu found a small, inconspicuous motel tucked along the coast. It seemed like the perfect place to lie low for a while, away from the prying eyes of whatever forces were stalking him. He checked into a room under an alias, hoping to avoid any attention. But as he entered the room, something felt off. It wasn't the creaking floorboards or the faint smell of mildew. No, it was something far more unsettling. He sat down on the bed and glanced around. A chill ran down his spine when he saw a small unmarked envelope sitting on the desk. His breath caught in his throat as he walked over to it, his hand trembling slightly as he picked it up. The envelope was plain, no return address, no indication of who it was from. Inside, there was only a single piece of paper. He unfolded it, his eyes scanning the message that was written in black ink. "We're always watching. Don't think you can run. You'll never escape your past." Keanu felt his blood run cold. He hadn't told anyone where he was going, and yet somehow they had found him. Whoever they were closer than he had ever imagined. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. Keanu froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He moved quietly toward the door, pressing his ear to it. There was no sound of footsteps, just the knock again, soft, deliberate. His hand hovered over the door handle, unsure whether to open it or not. If he opened the door, was he walking into a trap? If he didn't, was he giving them the upper hand? With a deep breath, he pulled the door open, half expecting someone to be standing there. But there was no one. Instead, a single piece of paper was lying on the ground just outside the door. Cautiously, Keanu bent down and picked it up. This time the message was different. "It's time for you to face what you've been running from. Your past has a price." Keanu's heart hammered in his chest. This wasn't just a game, it was personal. Whoever was after him wasn't just trying to intimidate him. They were trying to draw him into something much darker, something tied to his past that he had long since buried. The truth was, Keanu had run from his past for years. He thought he had left it behind, convinced that the things he had done, the mistakes he had made, had no place in his present life. But now they were back, bigger and more dangerous than ever. And as the pieces of this puzzle began to fall into place, Keanu realized that there was only one way out. He would have to confront the ghosts of his past, the very things he had tried to forget. But doing so meant facing the truth, something far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. As Keanu closed the motel door and locked it behind him, he felt the weight of his decision settle in. He was no longer running. The journey ahead would be perilous, filled with unknowns, but it was the only choice he had left. He could feel it in his gut. This was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. The next few days blurred into a haze of confusion and fear. Keanu's mind was a whirlwind of questions, his every thought consumed by the cryptic messages, the calls, and the shadowy figures that seemed to follow him wherever he went. He couldn't trust anyone, not even the few people he still had in his life. But there was one thing he knew for sure. Whoever was behind this knew exactly how to push his buttons, to dig into the very heart of his deepest, darkest secrets. It was late one evening when Keanu found himself standing in front of a modest house in the hills of Northern California. The old wooden structure, with its peeling paint and broken-down fence, looked unremarkable, almost forgotten. But to Keanu, this house meant everything. It was where his past had come to an end, where the tragedy that had shaped his entire life had occurred. He had never spoken about this place to anyone, not even Lawrence. It was his secret, the place where his sister, Kim, had died. The memories flooded back with crushing intensity. The night of the accident, the police, the ambulance, the devastation on his mother's face as she collapsed in grief. Keanu had never been able to let go of the guilt. He had been there. He had failed to save her. He had failed to protect the one person who had always been there for him. The house had been abandoned for years. After Kim's death, it had been sold off, and Keanu had made it a point to never come back. But now something had drawn him here, something he couldn't ignore. It felt as though he was being pulled into the very place that had haunted his dreams for so long. He approached the front door, hesitating for a moment before he pushed it open. The hinges creaked, the sound cutting through the silence like a knife. Inside, the air was thick with dust, the remnants of a life long since abandoned. The wallpaper was faded, and the furniture was covered in white sheets, as if the house itself was still frozen in time. Keanu stepped inside, each step a reminder of what had been lost. His breath came in shallow gasps as he walked through the rooms, the echoes of his past reverberating in his mind. And then at the far end of the hallway he saw it, a photo on the wall. It was a family portrait, Keanu, his mother, and his sister, Kim. They were smiling, their eyes full of hope and warmth. It seemed like a lifetime ago, but in that moment it felt as though time had stood still. Keanu's hand trembled as he reached for the photo. He stared at it for a long time, the guilt flooding back like a tidal wave. He had failed her. He had failed his family. But as he stood there, something caught his eye, a small folded piece of paper that had been tucked behind the frame. His heart raced as he pulled it out and unfolded it. The handwriting was familiar, and yet not. It was his sister's handwriting, but the message was chilling. You don't remember, do you? You were never meant to forget. The truth is closer than you think. The words sent a shockwave through Keanu. His breath hitched as the room seemed to close in on him. He stumbled back, his heart pounding in his chest. What was happening? How? Had this been left here? How had Kim known? The truth was closer than he thought. That much was certain, but what truth? What had he been running from for all these years? Suddenly, a noise echoed through the empty house, breaking Keanu from his thoughts. A door slammed, followed by footsteps. Someone was here, he wasn't alone. His pulse quickened as he turned toward the sound. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure, tall, cloaked in shadows, with a face Keanu couldn't quite make out. The figure stepped forward, and Keanu instinctively took a step back, his hand reaching for anything to defend himself. But there was no weapon, no escape. The figure spoke, their voice low and menacing. You've been running from this for too long, Keanu. You can't outrun the past. It will always catch up to you. Keanu's mind raced. Who was this person? How did? They know so much about him. But there was no time for answers. He had to act. Without thinking, Keanu bolted for the door, adrenaline pumping through his veins. But as he reached for the handle, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the walls. Where do you think you're going? The figure taunted. You can't leave here until you face what you've done, until you face the truth. Keanu's breath was ragged, his chest tightening with fear. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air growing heavy with the weight of his past. Every step he had taken, every decision he had made to run away from the pain, had led him to this moment. And then, with terrifying clarity, it hit him. The truth that had been buried for so long, the truth he had been avoiding all these years, was standing right in front of him. The figure moved closer, and Keanu saw the face for the first time. It wasn't someone he knew. It was something far worse. It was a reflection of himself. For the first time, Keanu understood. The past, the guilt, the darkness. It was all within him. It wasn't something he could run from anymore. And in that moment, everything changed. As the truth crashed down on him, Keanu knew that the path ahead would not be easy. But it was the only path left. He had no choice but to face the darkness, to confront the demons that had haunted him for so long, and he would do it alone. The silence that followed was deafening. Keanu stood there, frozen, staring at the figure that had somehow become the mirror of his own soul. The room seemed to pulse with an energy all its own, as if the house itself was holding its breath. The past, the mistakes, the guilt, it all had a voice now echoing through every corner of the room, and Keanu couldn't escape it. The figure spoke again, this time with a softer, almost regretful tone. "How you've been running from yourself for so long, Keanu, but there's no running left. The truth, it's not just about what happened. It's about what you didn't do. It's about how you let it define you." Keanu's breath caught in his throat. The weight of those words crushed him like a boulder. What you didn't do. He had spent so many years blaming himself, thinking he could never forgive himself, thinking he could never undo what had happened to Kim. But what if there was more to it than just failure? What if, all along, he had been missing the key to his own healing? He looked at the figure before him, but it had already started to fade into the shadows, the room growing cold in its wake. The figure wasn't physically leaving. It was simply fading into the memories it had come from, memories Keanu had long buried. He reached out instinctively, but the figure was gone. Keanu's legs gave out, and he sank to the floor. His hands gripped the sides of his head as if trying to hold himself together, as if keeping himself whole. The room felt so small, so suffocating. The house, the memories, the regret, it was all too much. He closed his eyes tightly, wishing he could erase it all, wishing he could undo everything he had failed to prevent. But as he sat there, broken and gasping for air, something strange happened. His thoughts started to slow. The tidal wave of guilt and confusion began to recede, and in its place something else emerged, a quiet understanding. Keanu took a deep breath, letting the air fill his lungs. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past begin to lift. The truth he had avoided, the guilt he had carried, was no longer a burden. He could feel it. He could feel himself starting to let it go. He didn't need to fix everything. He didn't need to save his sister. He couldn't change the past, but he could change how he carried it. The realization hit him like a wave of clarity. The only thing that had been holding him back all these years was his own refusal to forgive himself. And now, he could finally let go. Standing up slowly, Keanu wiped the tears that had fallen, the weight of his sorrow slowly lifting with every breath. His body felt lighter, almost as though he were shedding years of pain. He looked around the house one last time. It was still the place of loss and sorrow, but it no longer had control over him. The chains of his past had loosened. Keanu turned and walked out of the house, the door creaking shut behind him. The air outside was crisp, the sun beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the horizon. He had taken the first step toward peace, and though he didn't know what the future would hold, he knew he had finally faced the truth. As he drove back toward the city, Keanu felt something within him shift, a deep, quiet sense of resolution. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first received that midnight call. He had learned to confront his past, to face his darkest moments, and to forgive the one person who had been hardest to forgive, himself. The road ahead was still uncertain. There were still questions, still mysteries about the people who had been following him, still dangers he needed to face. But for the first time in a long time, Keanu felt ready to face them head-on, because now he understood something he had never fully grasped before. The journey wasn't about running from the past. It was about accepting it and choosing to move forward. He hit the gas pedal and sped down the open road, the weight of the world slowly but surely lifting off his shoulders. The truth had set him free, and now, with nothing but his future ahead, he was ready for whatever came next. So, what do you think, folks? If you were in Keanu's shoes, would you have been able to face your past like he did? Or would you keep running from it? I'd love to hear your thoughts, so make sure to drop a comment below. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button for more thrilling stories like this one. You never know what's waiting around the corner. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Keanu's journey had just begun. While the weight of his past had lifted, the darkness that had been following him for so long was far from gone. The truth he had faced in the old house hadn't solved all his problems. In fact, it had only revealed more questions. There were still people out there, people who knew too much about him, who were still intent on dragging him back into the past he had tried to escape. But now Keanu was ready. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't running. The ghosts of his past no longer controlled him. He was free to move forward, but that freedom came with a cost. His next steps would be even harder. It was 2 weeks later when the call came. Keanu was staying in a small cabin near the coast, trying to find some peace after the chaos of the past few weeks. His phone buzzed, interrupting the quiet morning as he sipped his coffee. The name on the screen made his heart skip a beat. Lawrence. Keanu hesitated for a moment before answering. The last time they spoke, Lawrence had been the one to give him the warning. They know too much about you. Now Keanu wasn't sure if he should be relieved to hear from his old friend, or if he should prepare for another nightmare. Keanu, Lawrence's voice crackled through the phone. We need to talk. It's not over. They're getting closer. Keanu stood up, suddenly alert. Who's getting closer? He asked, his voice low. The people who've been after you, the ones who've been watching your every move. Lawrence's tone was urgent, filled with a sense of dread. Keanu, there's something you need to know, something big. They're not just interested in you. They're interested in everyone who's ever been close to you. Keanu's stomach churned. He hadn't realized it before, but the warning was clear now. These people, whoever they were, had been using him to get to something much bigger. They weren't just after Keanu, they were targeting everyone he loved. Where are you? I'll come to you, Keanu said, his voice determined. No, it's too dangerous, Lawrence replied quickly. They've already found me. I don't have much time. Keanu's heart raced. Lawrence, what are you talking about? Who's after us? Who are these people? Lawrence took a deep breath before speaking again. They're part of a group, Keanu, a secret organization, and they've been watching us for years. You and I, we're just the tip of the iceberg. They've got bigger plans, and we've been caught in the middle of it all. Keanu's mind reeled. A secret organization. This was beyond anything he could have imagined, but something in Lawrence's voice made him realize the danger was real. More real than anything Keanu had faced in his life. Listen to me, Lawrence continued. There's a place, a safe house where we can hide. I'll give you the coordinates. You need to get there, Keanu. The only way out is to face them head on, and you won't make it alone. Keanu knew his old friend was right. This wasn't just about protecting himself anymore. It was about protecting everyone he cared about, and that meant he couldn't afford to be afraid anymore. I'm on my way, Keanu said, hanging up the phone without another word. The drive to the safe house felt endless. Keanu couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, that at any moment someone would pull him off the road and drag him into the shadows. But he pushed those thoughts aside. He couldn't afford to be distracted now. The coordinates Lawrence had given him led him deep into the forests of Northern California, to a place so isolated it felt like the middle of nowhere. As he pulled up to the house, Keanu felt a strange sense of déjà vu. This place was remote, hidden from prying eyes. He couldn't help but think back to the old house where everything had begun. It was as if fate was drawing him toward these places, forcing him to face the truth he had so long ignored. Keanu parked his car in front of the small cabin. The house looked abandoned, the windows dark, the wooden door slightly ajar. His instincts told him to be cautious, but there was no turning back now. He stepped inside. The air inside was thick with dust and silence, but as he ventured deeper into the house, a faint sound reached his ears. A voice. He followed the sound, his pulse quickening as he reached the back room. There, sitting at a table, was Lawrence. But something was off. Lawrence's eyes were wide with fear, his hands trembling as he looked up at Keanu. "They found us," Lawrence whispered, barely audible. "Keanu, they're here, they're in the house." Before Keanu could react, a loud crash echoed through the cabin. The door slammed shut behind him, and he spun around to see a group of figures dressed in black, their faces obscured by masks blocking the only exit. "You've come too far, Keanu," one of them said, in a low, menacing voice. "You should have stayed hidden. Now you've led us right to your friends." Keanu's mind raced. This was it, the moment he had feared. These people weren't just threatening him anymore, they were threatening everyone he cared about. But Keanu wasn't going to let them win, not now. With a sudden burst of adrenaline, he reached for the nearest object, a broken chair, and hurled it at the nearest figure, knocking them back. The others moved quickly, surrounding him in seconds. But Keanu was ready. His years of training, his instinct to survive, everything he had learned throughout his life came flooding back in that moment. "You'll have to do better than that," Keanu muttered, gritting his teeth. The battle that followed was chaotic, intense, and filled with the kind of desperation that only comes when there's no way out. But Keanu fought with everything he had, for Lawrence, for himself, for the truth. And as the last of the figures fell to the floor, Keanu stood panting heavily. His chest was tight, his hands shaking. He turned to Lawrence, who was staring at him in shock. "You were right," Keanu said, voice strained. "They won't stop, but I won't stop either." Lawrence nodded slowly, his eyes wide. "You're not alone in this, Keanu. Not anymore." As Keanu looked around the room, he realized something. This wasn't just about running anymore. It was about standing tall, facing the darkness, and reclaiming everything he had lost. He wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. He was fighting for redemption, and no matter what happened next, Keanu was ready to finish what he had started. Keanu's journey has taken him to dark places, but he's not backing down. What do you think? Can he defeat the shadows of his past, once and for all? Let me know what you think will happen next, and don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. We've only just scratched the surface, and the journey ahead promises even more shocking twists. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment and share your thoughts. The days that followed were a blur of planning, caution, and quiet tension. Keanu had never known fear like this. There was always danger in his life, always the threat of losing something or someone. But this was different. The organization, the people who had been hunting him and his loved ones, were relentless. They wouldn't stop until Keanu and Lawrence were nothing but distant memories, buried under the weight of secrets too dangerous to be exposed. The safe house, hidden deep in the woods, had been compromised. The attackers hadn't just found them. They had taken the place apart, searching for something. And in their wake they had left nothing but destruction and a chilling reminder: we know who you are. Now Keanu had only one option: to face them head-on. The time for running was over. But the problem was he didn't know who was pulling the strings. He didn't know who was really behind this. The truth had been tangled in webs of lies, and each step closer to the truth seemed to bring even more questions. But this time Keanu wasn't going to search in the dark. He had a lead, a name: the Architect. The Architect was said to be the leader of the organization, a shadowy figure whose true identity was known only to a select few. Everything Keanu had experienced, everything that had happened to him pointed to this person, and if he could find them, he could put an end to the whole thing. Keanu and Lawrence sat in the small, dimly lit room of a new hideout. The walls were covered in maps, photographs, and scribbled notes, everything Keanu had collected about the mysterious group that had been hunting him. It had taken weeks to put the pieces together, but now they had a clear path forward. "We're close, Keanu," Lawrence said, his voice grave. "I can feel it. But this won't be easy. We don't know who we're up against, but whoever they are, they've been in control for a long time." Keanu nodded, his jaw clenched. "I don't care who they are. I'm ending this, for good." Lawrence handed him a folder, his hands shaking slightly. "The Architect's real name is Thomas Adler. He's a former government contractor who went rogue. Everything about him is classified: his whereabouts, his connections. but we've tracked him to a location in the mountains. Here it's a compound, highly secure. Keanu's mind raced. How do we get in? Lawrence paused, then said, We don't. We go in, guns blazing. The next morning, as the sun began to rise, Keanu and Lawrence found themselves standing in front of a heavily fortified compound. The air was cold, the mountains towering over them like sentinels. The compound itself was nothing short of a fortress, surrounded by barbed wire, security cameras, and armed guards at every entrance. This is it, Keanu muttered, looking around. No turning back now. Lawrence gave him a grim smile. I knew it wouldn't be easy, but we've come this far, Keanu nodded. Together they had trained for this moment, every muscle, every move honed to perfection. They had no choice but to fight. The walls of the compound were built to keep people in, not out. And as Keanu moved forward, he felt a surge of adrenaline, the same feeling he had when he first stepped into the world of danger years ago. They made their move swiftly, using the shadows to stay out of sight, navigating through the dense woods surrounding the compound. With each step, Keanu's heartbeat quickened. His mind raced with everything that could go wrong. But there was no time for hesitation. As they approached the fence, Lawrence gestured toward a small gap in the security, just wide enough for them to slip through. On 3, Lawrence whispered. 1, 2, 3. They slipped through the gap, moving silently, toward the back of the compound, where an unguarded entrance awaited them. Keanu's every nerve was on edge. Every sound felt like it was amplified. But they pressed on, sticking to the shadows. Finally, they reached the main building, the heart of the compound. It was a large, imposing structure, with steel walls and windows that were barred shut. It seemed impenetrable, but Keanu had come this far. He wasn't backing down now. He pulled out his gear, a small set of tools he had used countless times before, and began working on the door lock. His fingers moved quickly, expertly. He knew the risks. If they were caught now, it would all be over. But with each second that passed, the lock clicked and the door creaked open. The inside of the compound was eerily quiet, like the calm before the storm. Keanu's senses were on high alert as they moved through the narrow hallways, avoiding the few guards that were scattered throughout the building. Lawrence leaned in close. We're getting closer, I can feel it. Keanu didn't respond. He was focused, his eyes scanning every corner, every door. The truth, the architect, was within his reach. As they rounded a corner, Keanu stopped dead in his tracks. Ahead, a door marked Director's Office loomed. This was it. This was where Thomas Adler, the architect, would be. The mastermind behind everything. The person who had been pulling the strings for so long. Keanu took a deep breath and nodded to Lawrence. It was time. They moved toward the door, their footsteps silent on the polished floor. Lawrence nodded, and Keanu opened the door with a swift motion. Inside, standing with his back to them, was a man Keanu had only seen in photos, Thomas Adler. The architect. Adler turned slowly, his face calm, almost amused. I've been expecting you, Keanu. Keanu's pulse surged. He had finally found him, but Adler's calm demeanor only fueled the fire in Keanu's chest. He wasn't afraid. Anymore, what do you want? Keanu asked, his voice cold. Adler smiled faintly. What do I want? I want what I've always wanted, Keanu. Control, power, and you're the key. You always have been. Keanu stepped forward, his fists clenched. Not anymore. Without warning, the room erupted in chaos. Guards poured in from every direction, and gunfire rang out. But Keanu, fueled by years of pain and determination, fought like a man possessed. His every move was calculated, deliberate. The fight was brutal, but Keanu fought with a fury that came from deep within, for the truth, for Lawrence, for the redemption he had been seeking. And when the dust settled, Thomas Adler lay on the floor defeated. Keanu stood over him, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. For the first time he felt at peace. The nightmare was over. He had faced the darkness and he had won. Keanu's battle has come to an end. But what do you think will happen next? Has Keanu truly won, or is there still more to this story? Let me know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling adventures. You won't want to miss what's coming next. And as always, where are you watching from? I'd love to hear your thoughts. The battle was over, but Keanu knew that victory came with its own heavy weight. As he stood there looking down at the defeated Thomas Adler, the realization set in. This wasn't just about defeating an enemy. It was about facing everything he had once run from and finding peace in the ashes of that fight. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Keanu didn't flinch. He had already anticipated the authorities' arrival. This had been the moment of truth, and while the architect was gone, the world still needed to know what had happened. "We should leave." "Now," Lawrence said, his voice urgent as he grabbed Keanu's arm. Keanu nodded silently, his mind still reeling. But he wasn't just running anymore. He had made sure that the right people would know what had truly happened. This fight wasn't just for his survival. Say it was for the truth to come to light. As they made their way out of the compound, the first rays of dawn broke over the mountain horizon, casting an orange glow across the desolate landscape. The weight of the past few weeks seemed to lift as the sun climbed higher. Keanu breathed in deeply, the cool air filling his lungs. It felt like the first true breath of freedom he had taken in years. They reached the extraction point, a small helicopter waiting for them. Lawrence had arranged everything in advance, and now, as they climbed aboard, Keanu finally allowed himself to relax, just for a moment. As the helicopter lifted off, leaving the compound behind, Keanu looked out at the vast landscape below. It was a symbol of everything he had been fighting for: freedom, redemption, and the chance to start anew. Days passed, and Keanu found himself in an unfamiliar place, a city where no one knew his name, where he could walk down the street without looking over his shoulder. The quiet life was a foreign concept to him, but it was a concept he was starting to embrace. The world outside was still full of uncertainty, but Keanu was no longer running from it. Lawrence was still by his side, and the bond between them had only deepened after everything they had been through. Keanu had lost so much over the years, but now he was starting to understand the importance of what he still had: his friendship, his freedom, and the knowledge that he had done what was right. They were sitting in a small cafe one afternoon when Lawrence turned to him, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "So, what now?" Lawrence asked, his voice filled with a quiet curiosity. Keanu looked out the window, watching the world move around him. For the first time in what felt like forever, he didn't have an answer. But that was okay. He wasn't looking for a destination anymore. He was simply living in the moment, free from the weight of the past. "I don't know," Keanu said with a smile, a sense of peace settling over him. "But I think that's okay." For the first time in years, Keanu felt like he could breathe easy. The battles he had fought, the people he had lost, and the darkness that had haunted him, it was all behind him. The truth was out, and while the world might never fully understand the weight of his journey, Keanu had finally come to terms with it. He had faced the impossible, and in the end, he had come out on top. And with that, Keanu's story comes to an end. But what do you think? Was this truly the end, or is there still more to come for Keanu and Lawrence? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, as there may be more thrilling stories waiting just around the corner. Where are you watching from? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this journey.